Hello, everyone. Um, my presentation is about semantic networks of word association data generated by large language models and comparing those to that of word association networks generated by humans. So word associations have been studied by psychologists for a long time. And one reason is that word association data provides a unique window into the inner world of people who produce those associations. When we collect a lot of word association data from people, we can systematically analyze this data and gain insights into the verbal and non-verbal experiences and the worldview of these people. So a really famous word association study is the Small World of Words project. This is led by Simone Dedine. You can go to this website and contribute word associations to many other languages, not just in English. But what you can see is that a keyword is presented to you on the top, and you're asked to generate up to 3 associations to that keyword. So this is a very simple task. In my research, I have adapted this study to collect the word association data from native speakers of Singapore English. And so this includes some words that are unique to Singapore English. Sometimes they're known as Singlish words and concepts, one of which is presented here, wayang. And we collect this data from native speakers of Singapore English. Very recently, researchers have also asked large language models to generate word associations. And so Abramsky et al. Developed a data set of word associations from 3 large language models based on the same set of keywords from the SWOL project. And so the LMs are participants, and this is the prompt that they use. The authors took the data and made semantic networks, and to validate the data, what they did was to do some analyses of simulations of spreading activation. And I think it's just to establish that the word associations from the large language models can replicate well-known semantic priming effects, just as the network from the SWOL data. And so if you look at the graph, you can see that there are higher activation levels for related word pairs as compared to unrelated word pairs, as you would predict. So the goal of this research is to try and probe and explore the nature of these LLM word associations in greater detail. And specifically, we want to look at the underlying semantic organization of LLM-generated associations and how those compare to human associations. An approach that we took that's a little bit different from the Abramsky et al. Research is to use a bipartite network representation. We will go through this in more detail later, but what this does is to control for the different varying numbers of associates produced between the LMs and the humans. And then when we have the network, we will compare its macro and micro level structural properties using some network science measures. An additional goal of this research is to compare the networks of the SWOL participants who are mainly from North America and the network that is produced by native speakers of Singapore English. And we will compare the networks, but we also look at the nature of the associations at the item level. So for bipartite networks, how is it different from the usual network, usual semantic networks? So in Abramsky et al., what they did was that to connect directly the cues and the responses. And so if a keyword elicited a particular response like cat and dog, then they would just connect these words up. And so both the cues and responses can be nodes in that network. So what the bipartite network does that's a bit different is that it is only allowing the cues to be nodes in this network. And the rule is that we will only connect pairs of keywords if they elicit the same associations. So what this does is that it will match the networks on in terms of size. So the number of nodes will be the 233 keywords that we are specifically looking at in this work. And so the number of nodes will be matched. But I think what's also really useful is that we also get a representation that reflects this sort of latent semantic representation, right, that produce these associations. So remember that the two keywords are connected if they elicit similar associations, not because they're directly eliciting each other. And so the assumption is that if the two keywords are eliciting similar associations, these cues share some underlying semantics. And so the bipartite network is capturing this higher order semantic organization. So we use the associations from SPO and from Singlish SPO. And so the difference is the people, which variety of English that they speak, and there are three LMs that we have data for. We filtered this data set so that we get the associations that are provided to a common set of 233 keywords. And some examples here just to illustrate that these English keywords are nothing special. They're pretty high frequency, quite common. We had a range of concrete and abstract concepts, various parts of speech, and so on. And so what we have is of this association data, which you can depict in a Q response sort of matrix. And what we have to do is some math to convert that into a Q only matrix. And we have a mathematical equation here that shows you how we are connecting the pairs of keywords. But the general idea is that if a pair of Qs are producing the same associations, and these associations are distinctive in the data set, then we would connect them with a larger connection weight. Okay, so let's go ahead and have a look at our results. So first of all, we want to look at the overall structure of the human and the LLM networks to see how they're similar and how they're different. So here are the 5 networks. If you want to hazard a guess which 2 are the human networks and which 3 are the LLM networks, you can pause the video right here. But otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and reveal, right, that the first 2 networks are the human networks. You can see that they're very densely connected, and the LLM networks are not as densely connected. We can zoom in on a specific node. Here we have the ego network of the keyword abstract. And I didn't put the labels here, but I think you can tell which network is the human network. It's the orange one. You can see that there are a lot of other nodes, many other concepts that are very richly connected. And the network on the right is the network from the large language model. We can take off the network's edges, the links between the keywords, and see how much overlap there is. And you can see that there's a good amount of overlap between the 2 human networks and less between the humans and the LLM networks. We can also display some network metrics here to give you a sense of the overall network structure of these networks. I think a couple of things to note. The 2 human networks seem to be more densely connected than the LLM networks, as shown by the density and the CC clustering coefficient measures. The human networks also appear to be a bit more small, right? You can see that the average shortest path length and the diameter is quite small relative to the LLM networks. That does suggest that these networks are more efficiently connected. It's easy to navigate the network because you don't need that many steps or long path to traverse the network. In the interest of time, not showing the statistical analysis, but we did do a case-wise bootstrapping approach, sampling with placement to create bootstrap networks, and then we did some permutation tests and some encoders to confirm the differences that we see here in this table. So let's go ahead and have a look at the micro level measures. So here we are focusing on the individual nodes in these networks, getting some information about its structure, and then we want to see how these measures correlate across the 5 networks. So I'm going to show a bunch of metrics, but the general pattern is actually the same for all of them. If you look at the bottom left, right, these are the correlation between the two human networks. The this correlation is always much higher than any of the other correlations that you'll see in this table. So the correlations between the humans and LMs and among the LMs are not as high. So this is for degree, where we are actually computing the number of connections incident onto a target node, right? You can see in the top right a little example to depict this network metric. I'll quickly go through the next few ones. We also did the same for strength, so we're taking the sum of all the edge weights. Again, we see the same pattern here. We can also look at interconnectivity of a node's neighboring nodes, right? Which is local clustering coefficient. Again, we see the same general pattern in the correlations and the same for closeness centrality as well. And that indicates that concepts that are central in one human network also central in another human's network, but we don't see any significant correlations with the LM networks. So in this section, we have results comparing the associations from SPO and from Singlish SPO. And we just want to see how are these associative responses, how similar they are or how different they are across the two human groups. So what we did here is to just depict a histogram of the cosine similarity of the response vectors for each of the 233 queues across these two networks. The mean is quite high. It does suggest that the same keywords are receiving very similar kinds of associations from the SWO participants and from the Singaporean participants. But we also notice on this graph that there are some cues that have quite dissimilar associative patterns. And here are some examples of those keywords with the most dissimilar response patterns, and to provide some examples of the associations that they elicited from the two different groups are shown on this slide. So I think what's quite striking is that even for words that we might perceive its meaning to be quite straightforward, quite basic, uh, we actually get quite different sets of associations from people who speak different varieties of English, really suggesting that there's a lot of semantic nuance, right, in the representation of these concepts. So, a summary of the results. The human networks appear to be more densely interconnected than LM networks. They also are more efficiently connected. If we are looking at its global and local structure, we see that the two human networks look more like each other than to the LM networks. And among the three LM networks, they don't really resemble each other as much. When we look at the two human networks, they are generally quite similar, but we also see some nuances in their associative responses. And so let's quickly discuss the implications of this work. I think sort of going back to the first slide where we talked about how word associations provide a kind of a linguistic worldview into the people that produce the word associations. We can sort of probe these word associations by looking at its latent semantic structure using a bipartite network analysis. And we find that DLM networks have much lower interconnectivity in this latent semantic structure. And it's much lower than the human network, suggesting that there might not be as much coherence, right, in their latent semantics. And maybe it's not that surprising, but the fact that the two human networks were very highly connected, they look quite similar to each other, and may just be a reflection of the fact that these two groups of humans do share a similar world image, and that is reflected in their word associations. That said, if we are looking at the SPO and the Singlish SPO data more closely, we do see some interesting nuances in the associations to some keywords. And I think it's worth, highlighting that it's important to really champion research that looks at the linguistic diversity that exists in the world. If we treat all English as the same, I think it's a huge opportunity cost to learning about what makes all these different cultures so interesting. As you can see in the Kaichu's circles, Singapore sits in this outer circle of Englishes, right? But there are various varieties of English spoken all around the world and a lot of rich, interesting questions to be asked. And word associations can provide one way of exploring cross dialect or cross variety semantic equivalents. LMs as psychology participants is a growing trend in psycholinguistics, and I think it appears to be quite good at reproducing human responses. That ultimately the LMs are producing average expected responses to a prompt. And recent work is showing that LM word associations are not fully capturing the variability that we have in human word associations. And so to conclude, I think what this work is contributing right to this topic is that LLM word associations, they're not just lacking in variability and diversity, but I think when we try to look at its latent structure of the associations, they do look very different from that of humans. And so overall, I do think that LMs can be a good tool for research in language and cognition, but let's continue to scrutinize it and try to ask good questions of this tool. So I would like to acknowledge my funders, right, who supported this research, and to the members of my lab, students who have contributed to the Singlish Word project. And thank you to you for listening. I have some reference here for you to refer to if you're interested to know more. Okay, and if you have questions, feel free to get in touch.